Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 9 here in Journalism 205. Dr. Shermak here. Happy to have you join me. And I'm very excited this week. We're switching gears a bit and we are turning to audio as part of our multimedia journalism sampler platter. So we've been working with photo. We worked a little bit last week with video and kind of audio. And now we're bouncing around a little bit. We're getting to audio. So this week and next week will be focused primarily on audio. I know you're still working on your video interview story. I think there's an element of audio in there as well, but this will be on audio only. And what we're going to talk about today are podcasting and audio storytelling. And I'm going to get into a little bit what that means, what are the differences there. We have those two categories. We'll also take a look ahead to what to expect for this week 9 module, and then we'll wrap it up for our week 9 video lecture. As I always remind you, if you have any questions at all, if you need help, come by my office hours, send me an email, contact me through Canvas, call me, anything you need. All right, I am here. Make sure to reach out as we move forward in the semester. These projects are getting a little bit tougher, and I understand that. So challenge yourself to be, to push yourself a little bit, to push yourself to find answers. But I am always here if you need me. So let's talk about podcasting and audio storytelling. And this is going to be a rather brief lecture because we're doing this over the course of 2 weeks, and there's also some excellent reading for you this week as well. But the big difference when we're talking podcast versus audio storytelling, I want you to think of audio storytelling as an umbrella category for this. All right. Audio storytelling can include a lot of different things. You can probably even put music under that umbrella. You can put talk radio under that umbrella. And another thing you can put under that umbrella is podcasts. So podcasts are a type of audio storytelling. When I mention an audio story, I'm talking about a particular unit of journalism. So a unit of journalism could be, for example, a news story or an opinion piece, a photo or a photo story. When we're talking about an audio story, that's just one story, a one-off individual story done purely with audio. Think about a segment on NPR. Think about sometimes you'll hear storytelling, on other radio networks besides NPR. I think NPR is kind of the default. They probably do it better than anyone, quite frankly. Um, but if you listen to news radio ever, that's kind of the style. And there's other um, platforms out there that broadcast this kind of style, but that's where that originated. When we're talking about a podcast, that typically entails a series. And when I say series, it means that there's multiple episodes of that podcast. It could be on one subject, such as like a true crime podcast, which I know is very popular, or it also could be like a news podcast that changes subjects week to week. Think about, for instance, The Daily from the New York Times. That's one of my favorite podcasts. So a podcast is a type of audio storytelling device. An audio story could be a podcast episode, but it's a singular unit of journalism. So a singular audio story, a singular podcast, so on and so forth. That will be important for you to know as we go forward, and especially when we arrive to your final project. Let's take a look at some numbers. These numbers were created this was a deep dive by the Pew Research Center. It's probably my favorite source of information. I know I've talked about it in this class, and if you've taken any of my other classes, you've heard me talk about it. The Pew Research Center, awesome source, pewresearch.org. They did a really deep dive in 2022 about podcast usage. And there's some numbers here that can really help us look at podcasts and think about their importance. So they asked U.S. adults where they get their how many. Let me try that again. They asked U.S. adults where if they get news from podcasts, and that's increased over the years. In 2021, this is when they did the survey. Remember, they don't always do these surveys. In 2021, 7% said they often got their news from podcasts. 16% said they sometimes did. Um, we can we can collapse those categories, and we can say with pretty good certainty that about a quarter of US adults get news from podcasts relatively frequently. Um, we can collapse the categories further and say about 44% of US adults have gotten news at some point from a podcast. Those are pretty good numbers. I know you think, well, that's less than half, that's less than a quarter, but that's pretty darn good because we're asking all adults. We're not asking just podcast listeners. So that's a really good number. What it means is that people are engaging with this platform. They're engaging with this vehicle. And if our job as journalists is to get people news, we want to find the places where they like to get news. We need to go to our reader. We cannot sit back and I should say we can go to our audience. We need to go to our audience. We can't sit back and let the audience come to us. That's the critical mistake that newspapers made in the early 2000s that cost a lot of newspapers their existence, not just a lot of money, but their existence. They are no longer around because they assumed that. So in this deeper dive into the number, that 23% who at least sometimes get news from podcasts, you can see on your screen the demographic breakdown of it. And I think men, women, none of these numbers are surprising. They're pretty balanced across ethnicities. Um, so nothing shocking really there. Um, One thing that I think is interesting, a few things I think is interesting, the political orientation of folks. That's pretty balanced. It's not like one side is skewed much higher than the other. That's pretty balanced. Even the income is balanced. So this is a little more balanced. You do see 80,000 plus is a little higher than the other areas, but by and large, it's pretty balanced across income. College educated or more is 28%. That's significantly higher than the high school or less educated. But the one that really, really catches my attention is that the most likely age category to listen to news on podcasts is 18 to 29. That is a very desirable demographic that is super hard to reach. I know it because I spend my days teaching these 18 and 29-year-olds you. Um, but that's besides the point. News organizations, really anyone, I don't care if you're trying to reach people for news, if you're trying to reach people for selling a product, whatever it may be, they're trying to get this demographic. It's young. It doesn't tend to be as affluent as, say, the 30 to 49-year-olds, but grabbing people young and creating a loyalty early in life, the belief is that they will tend to be customers for life. So if people who are just maybe getting into news view their news consumption being kind of normal through a podcast, they're going to continue that. Even the 30 to 49 is really surprising, not surprising, but really, I think, encouraging at 29%. The older population is less likely to get news from podcasts. This is flipping, for example, print on its head, right? And for print news, this is completely turned around and it skews much older. So what this is telling us is that this is a growing area for news. It has a lot of potential growth for news. It's something that is relatively balanced across a lot of demographics, and younger people are into it. In other words, to put it very simply, as journalists, we should be in this space producing news for this audience. There's no doubt. All right. So that's really important to think about here when we're considering why podcasts, why we do them. I've been involved pretty heavily with podcasting since 2016. In 2016, that's when I began my program at the University of Texas at Austin for my PhD in journalism. And as part of that program, I taught a class that was then called audio storytelling and has since changed its name to podcasting. Being involved in that class, though, enabled me to be involved with something that was just starting at Texas, which was their audio production house. It's called The Drag. And the first podcast they ever did, you can see the logo on the screen, called The Orange Tree. And it was an award-winning podcast. It was actually a true crime series about a murder that occurred at the Orange Tree Apartments near the campus there in Austin. And that was really fun to be involved there for a few years with The Drag. And I continue to listen to The Drag as well. And I would recommend it as a great example of audio storytelling. After that, just a couple of years ago, prior to my time coming to Cuesta, I started a podcasting network when I was the newspaper advisor at Orange Coast College down in Costa Mesa in Orange County. On the left, this is the logo for our very first podcast, called Scuttlebutt. We're the pirates, so we use a lot of pirate reference. We were the pirates. I was a pirate. So we use Scuttlebutt for our name. The students came up with that. I always liked it. And it was a news podcast. It very much sounded a little bit like The Daily, um, a little bit like NPR's First Up, if you heard those. I love the format of that. And it was really excellent to start that lab. I got the funding, I bought the equipment, and we got that going. You can see some of my former students there um, in working in the podcast production. So that was really fun and really cool experience. So I love podcasting. I love the production of it. And I'm always willing to talk about it if you're ever interested. We talked a little bit about why podcasts, but let's think about it from a journalist standpoint. We talked about how they're popular, right? There's an immense popularity. Podcast listening has gone up tremendously, especially in the last 5 years. The pandemic was very good for podcasts. More people started listening. Uh, but what podcasts do is they offer you a chance as a journalist to tell stories in very different ways, where not only are you using maybe your own voice or the voice of a narrator, but you're also using the voice of your subjects of your stories. You're using natural sound, which you'll read about this week, known in the industry as nat sound. You're using music, perhaps, as part of this. There's a lot of different things you can play with to really appeal to that audio sense that we have as humans. Another great thing about it is these are now relatively easy to transmit to mass audiences. You don't have to go through a radio station anymore. That's kind of where this idea of audio storytelling was born. You can upload your podcast to Spotify rather easily and reach millions of people around the world in a very short amount of time with very minimal effort. So that's when I talk about transmission capabilities being very high. It's a very exciting time. So this is a fun way to reach audiences. And if you have a knack for audio, it's something you really enjoy. My hope is in the next few years to really get a robust podcast system going for the Questonian, where we're producing these regularly and we're telling stories and conveying news. Um, it's a really powerful way to distribute news. Putting together a podcast, I talked about how transmission is relatively easy. It's all relative, right? Is relatively easy. But I don't want you to be fooled. Putting a podcast together involves a lot of thought. It involves the same kind of thought you would put together if you were doing a text-based written story. All right. I have this cartoon here. You see on the left, it says, so we're three generic white dudes with average experiences and opinions. Oh, you know what? Did we just start a podcast? Yeah. So we want to be a little deeper than that, probably. I always hear the joke, what do you call three white guys in a room with a microphone, a podcast? Um, we can go deeper. We can tell, again, it's journalism. It's just a different way of telling journalism. But you have to have a plan. You have to have a topic. You have to have a way of executing that topic and executing the story. You have to have the right technology, and you have to have an idea of how you're going to distribute it. Let's talk about those in a little bit more detail. So you don't want to one thing I think a lot of people think is that podcasts are just people riffing on a topic. Here's a topic, we're just going to talk about it. Sure, that can be done. And sometimes, it's nice for things to kind of go off the rails naturally and organically. But when we're talking about journalism and good journalism, again, I'm not here to teach you half-assed journalism or bad journalism. I'm here to teach you good journalism. If we're talking about good journalism, there's planning involved and there's a focus on a topic, and you want to get very specific. Um, Keep in mind that shorter podcasts tend to be more successful. Think about your own listening, and if you listen to podcasts, the chances are you're going for something shorter, like maxing out maybe at 30 minutes for a podcast. Maybe it's something that's like 10 or 15 minutes. People tend to get a little turned off overall when you get a podcast that goes north of 45, 60 minutes even. Sometimes there's those that are even longer. And part of it is because they haven't narrowed in a specific topic. So you want to keep your time tight. That keeps your audience focused. And that's just part of being a good journalist. People might say, oh, well, I like a podcast to be long and I like them to riff on everything. That's fine. That's a different type of podcast. I'm talking about a more journalistic style. And my idea behind this is do simple better. Focus on a simple, direct, straightforward topic and crush it. Get really detailed, get way down and dirty into the weeds with it, and really, really max it out. This is where you employ your journalistic skills. This is where you employ the same skills that you've been developing maybe in your other journalism classes or here in this journalism class. You're thinking of ideas, you're doing the reporting. Yes, podcasts take reporting, um, and you're doing the planning and the execution well. So it is a journalism act, right? It's a journalism act. That's how we make it tighter and more effective. Just like I said, treat this like any story. In order to execute a podcast, you're going to need to make a pitch. You're going to need sources. All right. You're going to need sources for the podcast. Um, you're going to need some kind of organization around a central topic, maybe even an outline, a script, even. A lot of good podcasts are scripted. So that's something you can think about as well. You don't want to sound like you're reading all the time, but they can be scripted. Some ways to generate ideas for this are asking yourself some questions. And the big one is, what do I want to hear? You know, you are a human, you are a student. What things interest you? There's a good chance they could interest others as well. What are you curious about? What do you want to know about? What do you wonder how something works? Do you wonder how something originated? Do you wonder what the future of a particular thing might be? And I'm using thing, I don't like the word thing very often, but I'm using it to be very generic and very vague because you can podcast about anything, right? Um, Another thing to think about when you're considering a podcast is this a good fit for audio? There's some stories that are maybe a better fit for video. Um, and you can do kind of a video style podcast if you want. Um, you'd be surprised how many stories you can make apply to audio. But can you go out and capture that nat sound we talked about? Can you go out and interview people? You don't want your podcast just to be one single voice all the time, right? You want some different sounds in there to keep the listener interest going. So is it sound friendly? Is it audio friendly, your idea? That's some ways to think about it. And like I said, create a script. It can be a very detailed script where every word is ready to go, or it can be like some kind of outline to keep you on task. Um, my lectures, I use my slides as kind of my rough outline, but I don't write out every word I'm going to say. I just kind of go. But using an outline, I have a plan when I come in for my lecture. I know where I'm going to stop and when I'm going to start and so on and so forth. So have something in mind when you're planning your podcast. You cannot forget about the technology, and the better your technology, the better your podcast is going to be. Now, as I always say in this class, your phone is going to be enough of a solid tool for you to do a good podcast. And it's true, right? Um, but one thing you really want to do is you want to make sure that you're capturing that initial sound really well. The rule is dirty sound in, dirty sound out. It's really hard to clean up sound if you get it and it's bad. What do I mean? Great example. Let's say you're doing a story about a paddle event for charity and you're down on the ocean. You're down in the ocean and you're interviewing people in their wetsuits getting ready to go out for this paddle, and you're talking to them, and the wind is absolutely howling, and everything that you have from that interview, and maybe it's multiple people, it's all obstructed by the wind. You can hear it on the microphone. It's hard to hear the voice. That's really, really hard to fix. Um, it's really hard to fix. So you have to put precautions in place. Find some sort of barrier from the wind, or use a really high end wind guard or something like that. Record yourself in advance of your interviews so you know what it's going to sound like when you're interviewing someone. And if you hear interference, if you hear anything, get somewhere different or change the way it's arranged, so you can get your audio right. Because again, dirty audio in, dirty audio out. And if as a listener, I can't hear it, I'm not going to engage. So that's really important. And it can even happen indoors. I had a situation when I was at Texas teaching digital audio, digital audio digital storytelling. There it is. I was teaching digital storytelling, and a student was interviewing someone inside of a classroom, and it sounded very quiet in there, and they felt really good about it. But then when they got back to the studio and we started rolling their tape, we heard this humming noise that was really noticeable and very distracting. And we went back to the room where they did the interview and just recorded dead air. We didn't, no one was talking. And we figured out that it was an air conditioning system in the room. Even though it was quiet, the microphone was picking up this humming. So record dead air. See what background noise is already existing, and try to find a way to get rid of that somehow. In this case, we just switched rooms. They redid the interview in a soundproof room. If you don't have to have a soundproof room to do good audio, though. Sometimes the best place for you to record audio is in a closet. All right, you have the clothes there that are sort of acting as a sound barrier. You're in a tight space. It's one of the better ways to record audio. So always be thinking about that. You have to account for the elements and the environment around you. As you can have the best microphone in the world, but if you're not thinking right about this, it can go haywire. Editing software, there's a ton of options out there. I list them in our upcoming assignment, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We'll focus on Adobe. Adobe Audition is the audio software that is usually the industry standard. I'd recommend learning that. This is not an Adobe class. Like I said, it's not a requirement that you need it. But there'll be some how-to videos in the week 10 module to help you learn that a little bit more for the assignment. But you can choose from any audio app or any audio software that you want. You may already be familiar with some like Audacity or a GarageBand, for if you have an Apple device, so on and so forth. You could also use those apps and that software to include music, that natural sound we've talked about. All that matters as well. So mixing those tracks, it's not the hardest thing in the world, but it takes a little bit of trial and error. It takes some skill to do that. But once you learn those skills and you start repeating them, it's going to be easier, and you're going to start really wanting to tell your stories through audio, which is pretty cool. Once you create that work, you want to distribute it, right? Think about, how do I get my work to my audience? And this is where, for example, something like the Questonian could come into play, where we have the capability of distributing an audio story to our audience, not only on our website, but also on our social media accounts, including Spotify. That's the goal, is to have a Spotify account to distribute this work. You can find new platforms as well. There might be other areas. We talk about SoundCloud a lot. But it's just a matter of putting that audio out there and making people aware of it. When you hear about a podcast, people often say, you can find this podcast anywhere you hear your podcast, because it's easy to distribute. It's easy to get it on Apple's podcasts and Amazon's and Spotify's and so on and so forth. It's not that difficult to do that. They want the content. So that barrier is fairly easy to cross for that. And we'll continue to talk about that more as we move through the class. I always include my complimentary question, my obligatory question slide, even though no one's here to ask me questions. But as always, if you have questions, don't hesitate to email. So in a nutshell, in summary, Podcasts are a different way of telling stories, but we must still adhere to our journalistic standards, our journalism ethics. It's vital to creating strong podcasts, but I love the idea of them. We're going to have a chance to work with some here coming up over the next 2 weeks, and listen to some audio stories as well. And then one option for your final project will be an audio story. All right. So let's take a look ahead and we'll talk about what we're doing here in the nearer term. This is for week 9. So you're going to start your week by reading a portion of a chapter in Adornado. It's chapter 5, and it's called From the Field, the Mobile Journalist. And this is the audio section. It's only a few pages. If you haven't noticed, Adornado's formatting, the text is very small, so there's a lot packed in. Most of your experience with audio for this week is going to come through your assignments. You'll get a nice little preview of audio here with Adornado, and those questions will be on the quiz. So definitely read that. I also have another reading. It's fairly brief about why natural sound is so important to your audio. This is a PDF on Canvas. You'll also want to take a look at the upcoming assignment. So this assignment is due 2 weeks out, which would put it at the end of week 10. And this is a podcast promo. So as you will read, what you're going to do is you're going to create a 30-second or less promo, like a commercial, for a podcast that you made up. And the podcast can be about anything. You need to include your own voice, some natural sound, some music, so on and so forth. And you're basically creating a podcast idea through a promo. So all the instructions are on Canvas, and you have a couple weeks to work on that. Don't forget you're finishing up the video interview assignment. So we're in our second week working on that. That's due at the end of this week, at the end of week 9. You also have your usual discussion and quizzes. The discussion board this week, sort of like we've done before, you're going to present good examples of audio storytelling. So we're talking about a unit that I talked about it before, that unit of journalism, the audio story. So maybe it's a podcast episode, a single episode. Maybe it's a single audio story from NPR or another news outlet. There's a lot of options there in the discussion, and it gives you a chance to look at some of those online and then also look at the ones that your peers chose. So that's the assignment for this week. And then, of course, we have the quiz over the readings, this video lecture, and the current events. All right. So that is what's on our menu for week 9 as we venture into audio. I'm really excited about it. As always, reach out with your questions and enjoy week 9. Let's have a good one. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Appreciate it, and we'll hear from you soon. Take care now.